This is ISACA's Page 2 podcast.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm John Brandt, Director of Professional Practices and Innovation here at ISACA. Joining me today about his recently released article, Managing Security Across Disparate Database Technologies, is Adam Kohnke. Adam is Cybersecurity Architect for Charter Next Generation. Adam, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on the podcast.
Well, I always enjoy these things. This is probably one of the most pleasurable things that I do as part of my job here. So if you just would, for our listeners or viewers here, just a little bit about yourself, your background, some level setting for our viewers.
Sure. So I've been in IT now for about 15 years. I come from an IT operations background, so help desk. I spent a lot of time in incident management in big and small companies. Spent some time as an IT auditor. But the better things about me is that I'm a father. I like to read. I like to play video games and go camping. But I make my money in cybersecurity right now, both as a cybersecurity architect. I've been in cybersecurity for 3 years, going on 4. And I've recently started my own business, the Excel Security Consultancy. And this article was its maiden project. So just a bit about me. Always happy to connect with anybody on LinkedIn if you want to talk anything IT audit or cybersecurity.
Well, excellent. That's a lot of us have come up through the proverbial ranks, right? And come up and I found your article interesting in the sense because I'll be honest with you, like I haven't touched a database in a hot minute. Really don't have a lot of desire to do it, but your unique background and skill set, right? It forces something to the surface that has to be addressed here. So I'm hoping that our viewers have some good takeaways from this. So we're going to jump right in here. Let's talk about what malicious activities databases are primarily susceptible today in the modern threat landscape.
Yeah, a lot of times they're left in a insecure default configuration. So you get them out of the box from a vendor or a software installation source. And whether it's a insecure networking service, sometimes there are things like test databases or, default ports, things of that nature that are open, default usernames, passwords. They're just laying around for anybody to come along and log into the database, start extracting data, jump from one database to the other, and just start stealing or mangling, destroying data. Insecure default configuration, that's always going to be a low-hanging fruit, so to speak.
So, something you said there just prompted a thought here about, more times than not, production environments have a development or test equivalent, right? And you just highlighted that. Through your experience and and the things that you do day to day, is that pretty common? And if so, do you find that the development / test environments are just forgotten about, and is the data equally as sensitive? Like, are they mirror images, or do you just think that more times than not they're just focused on the configuration, user interface or whatnot, and then worried about making sure that the production side is most accurate?
Yeah, I think it can even be a case where there really isn't a test or dev environment initially. And then for whatever reason, you need to run a test case to see how something will react in prod. You spin up a test database, and then you do your tests and you forget about it and just leave it as it is. We find things very often in the security space where, security is a foregone thought, or, it's not really thought about at all. People are just trying to do work and get work done. And then they forget about these insecure environments they set up and leave behind. So definitely it's prevalent. Not every database is going to come with, the database software won't always come with an available test or dev database, but often they do.
So along that line of thinking there, right? Because one of the things all too often, right? And you hit a point, and this is kind of the importance of the integration of security at the early onset, right? Is when we talk IT operations, more times they're just very responsive to whatever the business needs are, right? I think it's fair to say that there's a large number of enterprises out there, right? Companies, businesses, organizations that just don't have robust teams either. So when you find a lot of folks are just they're really strapped tight, right? And it could be the ops person is wearing the quote unquote security hat, or the lone security person is just overwhelmed that they can't really inject themselves into the process. So what are the things, how do you guard against that, right? We hear things like DevSecOps, right? But my fear is, in going back to my background, and when the database folks, database teams it used to be they weren't integrated really on the services side anyway. And I assume we expect that to be the case, but is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, oftentimes you do find under-budgeted, under-resourced security teams where too few people are wearing too many hats across various functions, and it leads to gaps in security or the deprioritization of security when it comes to things like applications and databases and networks. What to do about it? I mean, money is always great, but I think setting a good tone at the top, at the leadership level, security is not going to become important in an organization until it's important to leadership. So sometimes that takes education from security leaders, the security department, or executives to help them understand what the risks are. Always taking a risk approach to everything can help, shaping conversations around risks. As far as if we don't manage these apps and these environments properly, we don't have enough people to do the security priorities and accomplish the objectives of security, you're going to be breached, you're going to fail in security, and you're just going to have a bunch of problems. So again, tone at the top, education for the executive class, and helping them understand why security is a business enabler and not just a cost on the bottom line. I think that goes a long way.
So you just brought up education, and I was just I went back many, many years in my mind to a class that myself and a former colleague, we had to go. I think it was a MySQL class, and I'll tell you, I remember it being very painful. But are folks that are implementing databases, or if you're bringing in new people, there was a critical, let's say there was a gap in the resource for that. Is it common nowadays for somebody to go get the vendor training, or is it one of these things that you're using online resources, just trying to spin up? Because, when I think about that, when I went through that, I wasn't in security at the time, right? I was more, actually at the time I was an instructor and I had an operational role. But if I think about it, if they were still using that, not only is it valuable to have the ops person go to learn the ins and outs, but also the security person as well to go through as well. Because if they've not been exposed to that, they might ask some of the right questions.
Yeah, I can't speak to how it's been over the last, 10, 20 years, but I know even some of the developers I've worked with recently, they are, it's like, hey, I just got out of college. I just started coding things. In some places, there's not a developer role-based training curriculum or program in place, and then they just get to work. Here's this app. This is the environments you're responsible for. This is what we need to accomplish from a development, code functionality perspective. Get to work, and then it's putting the square in the round hole. we're just going to jam it in and make it work. And again, security just becomes something that either someone has to come in a focused role and be a security champion to push education for developers, or luckily or hopefully you do get developers and engineers that are versed in security and know what the bad things are. And OWASP top 10, that's the things that developers and database admins should be learning, because those are the security challenges for databases. It's going to be those top 10 areas of web application security.
Yeah, no, those are all great points. And it just, at the end of the day, and I think it speaks to how broad this greater IT industry, there's so much out there that no one program out there can cover it all, right? At the end of the day. And that we could have a whole nother conversation on, the importance of just-in-time training, right? And stuff like that, instead of these formal long production programs that by the time you get out anyway, like how much did you really retain unless it was cascading and really built upon one another. But so we're going to go back to the article here, and I appreciate some of that context and everything, because I do think journal articles such as yours, they only cover the topic, but there's that context that we need to add around it, right? To basically kind of set the stage and to really talk about how broad the issue is. But so in your article, you gave a lot of different recommendations. You had talked about ingredients for secure database configuration. What are the most important ones of that?
So yeah, you want to hide the database as much as possible, and that means its access port on the network, even what some of its names, or sometimes the server and infrastructure itself. It can be pretty obvious what a server is just by its name. So, it's security through obfuscation. It isn't the best. A lot of people don't even accept it as a security control, but it's better than just leaving everything as the default. So like MySQL, for instance, I think it's always accessible on port 3306. Well, if somebody does an Nmap scan against you and they see 3306, they can immediately assume they're dealing with a database on top of any other fingerprinting that they do. So, making it as hard as possible from a, hiding the database perspective helps. And then we touched on default usernames and passwords. Oftentimes, if you come to a login page or something, you can just get on Google and, what's the default username and password for this or that? And you can just log right in or attempt to brute force or guess your way into the database, and then it's game over. So, you want to put pitfalls and traps and trips in front of any adversary that's trying to get into your environment. So hiding the database, changing default usernames, passwords, disabling unneeded services, and anything along that line, it's going to improve security greatly.
You touched on that, about obfuscation. And the reality is, right, is to rely on it solely is not appropriate. And I think people would widely agree with that statement. But it is a tool in the toolbox. And to me, it speaks to the greater OPSEC, right, operational security considerations that need to be taken. And this expands far beyond just databases. It's the type of information that folks are putting out there on their web presence, because to your point, if you're a bad actor and you're fingerprinting and you're looking at, combing the web, because open source intelligence is alive and well, right? And you could get so much information off of that. And increasingly, I think, maybe if we did a better job in that too, we'd find, because you hear reports that there's still stuff that's being produced today that you can't change the default names, or you can't, or it's, or the passwords. And you would think by this part of our so far down the line that we'd be a lot better at that, and your manufacturers would be doing a better job. Because truthfully, until it becomes an overwhelming norm and folks stop buying products because of limitations like that, arguably they're not really incentivized to change their behavior, right?
No, I mean, everybody has a production first mindset. I need to produce products. I need to get them to the market as quickly as possible for the cheapest amount of money as possible. And then we will think about the ramifications of unsound security afterwards. It's any industry you look at, that is the way to go. It's all about profits and money. And then we deal with fallout as we come across it.
So let's talk about database encryption, right? Everybody knows, encryption is favored, right? You talk about this in your article. How should you be handling it? What are the potential pitfalls? Any do's and don'ts here that you could give to our viewers?
Yeah, you definitely do encrypt your logs, encrypt the database at rest. Use the strongest encryption algorithm and ciphers that are available to you that doesn't impact performance. It's usually AES 256-bit encryption at a minimum. If you can go higher, it always helps. Your logs or some of the transactional journals from the database, those can potentially be used to restore the database. So if they are captured in transit and they are unencrypted, someone can get a copy of your database or the information stored in the database that way. So definitely, poke and prod and make sure data at rest and data in transit is secured. If you can use column level encryption, even your administrators, you can implement column and or row level encryption to make sure certain fields like credit card numbers are inaccessible even to your admins. So that's always a good practice. And most of the commercial products offer all of that. So by default, they're available to you. You usually don't have to pay an extra license or anything. So just make sure you're fully utilizing what's already available to you to secure your databases.
So speaking of encryption, you talked about, some of the more, the more prominent players that are out there and it being included feature. Is it enabled by default, or is it still not, and you have to go through there and configure it?
I don't recall via the research, but some of it is not. Like I don't believe column level encryption is enabled by default in most of the enterprise commercial databases. Some of those things you need to set up like encryption keys, and you need to assign those to tables and columns. So yeah, you have to do some work on your part, but we provided the tools in the attached audit program to find out whether or not it's enabled.
Okay, so you just touched on audit here. So talk to me the role that the audit function within a company. How does that play in this whole process?
I mean, it changes from company to company, but not to be too much of a cliche, but you want to serve in that trusted advisor role, and you want to, sometimes it's good to just have a high level conversation with your auditees and not a full blown audit. Maybe understand, is there really risk here or not? Sometimes your security or data administrators are going to be on top of everything. And you can just, using some of the things in our article or the attached audit program, you can, just have a conversation with them. Well, how do you manage database security? What sort of encryption protections do you enable? How broad are those? We don't always need to audit things. Sometimes you can get a gauge of risk just by having a conversation with stakeholders on how they manage this or that regarding databases. But in the event where you're starting to get a bad feeling about this sounds really risky, then yeah, you should start moving into determining how you can provide value via a database audit.
So that brings up my next question here is the IT auditor role has transitioned a lot over time, right? And granted, everything's hyper focused on cybersecurity nowadays, but how much does the auditor need to know about in context of your article here about databases in order to actually provide meaningful feedback and assistance?
Yeah, databases are really complicated. They're not they're not like a printer, to give a bad example. They have hundreds of potential configuration variations. They can integrate with a lot of different systems and send data to a lot of different systems. So auditors need to know these systems very well before they even think about doing an audit. They should spend 5 to 10 hours reading the administrator guides from the product manufacturer. So when we did this article in the audit program, and my approach has always been, I'm going to learn the versions of the software that you're running. What's the host operating system? What's the version of your database management system? And then I'm going to spend a lot of time reading documentation from Oracle or Microsoft on the controls and how they work and what the potential options are. And then that is how you should be developing your audit programs. So spend less time talking to people and more time going over the documentation from the company that actually made the product, because that's where you're going to understand where all the risks are. People forget things, people try to cover things up, they try to lead you down a rabbit hole because sometimes people don't have time to deal with auditors. So you need to make sure you're on top of your game. And then if someone sends you for a loop, or they don't know how to get the information, that you already do.
That's a really great point, Adam. I'm thinking about this, right? Because largely speaking, operators of anything, they're looking for ways to make their job more efficient, right? How can I do a task faster? And that isn't, and when you were talking about like on the job training and whatnot, is if you don't go through a formal vendor onboarding or a class, right? Then how many bad habits are you picking up along the way that potentially the audit function, if the auditors are universally or largely doing that pre-work, right? Doing that investigative work before they actually go in there to do an audit or to provide assistance, to me, then it becomes a teaching moment of sorts, right? But it could also probably introduce some strife, right? Because I've been around a lot of, IT types, especially the ones that, not everybody's very receptive to the feedback, or it's just that leveraging that business as usual mindset that says, well, we do it this way because it allows us to do X, Y, and Z faster or whatnot.
Yeah, I guess going back to that trusted advisor cliche, I mean, how can you advise anybody on things you have no knowledge or expertise on? You're not going to be providing good audit recommendations or advice to clients if you don't understand the technology that you're auditing. So you don't have to take a course, you don't have to take a certification. Do a Google search, get a hold of the administrator guide, and spend a few hours reading about the subjects you're going to be auditing or having a conversation with the auditee about, and you're going to be much better off than you were had you just attempted to replay last year's audit or just go in, half blind. You need to do some research and understand these platforms, or else you're not going to have a very good outcome.
Okay, very good. So, besides the pre-work, talk to me about like audit procedures to help protect the databases.
When I audit things, I attempt to get read-only access to the tools. I think if a lot of auditees may not trust you enough to do that. Maybe you're just going to be requesting things. But, as long as you're running just select statements, if you're not doing like DML statements or modification statements against the database, there's really no harm in anything that you're asking for or auditing. Select statements are just going to pull data from the database. They shouldn't have any impact on the overall security or the integrity of the data.
So this brings up a good point, right? Because I remember, in my role here at ISACA, I'm also now responsible for the IT audit practice area. So I think about this, and this conversation has come up a bit when we've been working on different career opportunities, right? Whether it's professional development or right now, in your experience, is it now granted, so if you're an internal audit, then perhaps the likelihood of getting said read access is probably a little bit more common. If it was an external or even could be internal and there's that lack of trust, is it then that the auditor's sitting side saddle next to a DB admin and saying, hey, run this query so I can see what it does?
Yeah, I don't see any problem with taking that approach. I mean, you're basically just getting the information you're asking for from them faster. It'd probably be in everybody's best interest to do exactly that. That's probably the happy middle ground, actually.
Yeah, no, and obviously, the only downside I think to that is now you're carving out, human capital to support the audit, but that's not unusual to begin with. If there's any kind of inspection in any work role out there, right, you just know that somebody's either escorting, facilitating, getting the information. So, you've talked about database logging a couple times so far, and as from a security perspective, we know it's important, but beyond the fact that, you should, we also know that there could be some system, impacts or whatnot. But, based on what you wrote in the article and your professional judgment and experience, why is database logging a key and important consideration?
Yeah, so we're talking about like transactional logs, not logins, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, a lot of those logs contain the actual statements that people are running to extract or insert data into the database. So not only can you use that data to restore and exfiltrate the database data, you can start getting an understanding from a footprinting perspective. All right, what tables exist? I keep seeing this select from this table statement over and over again, or I keep seeing this username, or these credit card numbers. So the logs themselves are almost as valuable as the database itself, because depending on which one it is, like a transaction log, it's containing all of the inserts and updates and deletions. So as far as like threat, doing threat modeling against the database, understanding how big it is and what it contains, the logs are a very, very rich source of data.
No, that's a good point. One of the other thing is I read your article here, and something that stood out was, the potential damage that the proxy user function actually, the damage that can be done with it, right? And just how dangerous, right? And that goes for any kind of super user. But talk to me specifically to our listeners about that, because I thought that was an important talking point, about the need to really monitor that in like functions.
Yeah, so the proxy user function, I don't recall which one that was in. Was it in Microsoft or MySQL or?
I think it was MySQL.
I guess regardless of which one it is, I'm sure each of them have some sort of similar feature, but it essentially allows you the potential to masquerade as another user. So as far as, maintaining accountability over who did what in the database, if you have proxy users enabled and you don't have good compensating monitoring controls and, access review controls around who can be a proxy user, and if a breach occurs or data theft or abuse occurs with a proxy user account, you're going to have a very hard time proving who did what. So, maintaining a lot of security or eliminating the use of proxy users is kind of one thing that should be done early on.
What's the business value to keep said capability in databases? Like, how is it being used?
I don't recall. I think it's mostly for like applications. Okay. Like if you need like an application to log in as said system user, I think the proxy capability may allow you to do that. Or if differing, people from one location, maybe there's multiple vendors that log in, and you don't want to spin up a bunch of different user accounts for them. I don't recall the reason off the top of my head, but I think one of those might be true.
Okay, no, fair enough. And and again, it's one of those things. Like we do a lot of things out there. A lot of things perpetuate just because it's the way we've always done it, right? And when you talk about being able to either do an investigation or reconstruct incidents, to me, like anything like that makes it increasingly difficult to do that. And for the same reason we tell people don't use shared accounts, right? Like because it defeats all the underpinnings of good IAM.
Yes, it does.
Okay, so with all that, we've covered a lot of ground here today. In your view, what's the most challenging aspect of managing database security?
I think it's going to be the size of the data. It's going to be the number of people and transactions. I think we were in the article there, we cited some resources as far as if you were to put an internet exposed database out there and just allow connections to it, there's going to be hundreds of connections to it within about 10 minutes. So, trying to manage all of that traffic, even for something like a security information and event monitoring tool or any other network monitoring tool, if you're trying to make sense of all the transactions and user activity and the data transfers, it's probably going to fill up logs really quick. Logging is going to get really expensive. You can manage that with logging configuration, but just managing all the traffic and where things that are coming in, things that are going out, is it appropriate? How do you tell? That's always going to be a challenge as far as, is the transactional level operations on the database appropriate at any given time?
Yeah, those are all great points. Like I said, this was a good article. We went a little bit more into the weeds with this journal article, and I'm really talking about an important thing, because anymore data is that data is being wielded in a lot of different ways, and has become there is a huge value component to it, and we know that we largely struggle to manage, in this interconnected world that we're in. But Adam, I want to thank you for your time today. Great insights here. Anything you want to add that we didn't cover up to this point?
No, I don't think so. I mean, just, know what you're auditing. The producers of the technology, they give you everything you need to effectively audit your database environments and ensure they're secure. So, know your auditee, but know your admin guide. That's all I'd say.
Okay, very good. So if you want to read Adam's full article, click the link below in the description. I'm John Brandt. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you for joining us today for this episode of Page to Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode.